I was going to build a sample that contained all the controls in Silverlight 2 Beta 2, but then I realized that on Silverlight.net there already is such a sample. So if you go to Silverlight.net, you should be able to find this sample and have a look at it yourself. Essentially what we've got is a list of the built-in controls on the left-hand side and then examples of their use. Almost as important for me as having built-in controls is the fact that Silverlight 2 has a control framework, which means you can build your own controls in the same way as we have built our controls, and I think that's really critically important. So just looking down this list on the left hand side, we have simple controls like a button, so these are all buttons. Now some of these buttons are displaying arbitrary content over here, and we have another video where we talk about content controls, so you might want to check those out. But we've got a button here, we've got things like a checkbox, a simple control that we're quite familiar with from various pieces of UI. We have a radio button, another simple piece of UI. Things like sliders, so that's a fairly standard thing to want to put into a UI as well. And again, fairly simple things like tooltips, so here we have tooltips and so on. You might see that again we're into content controls where you might expect to only see a piece of text. You might see something more complicated in Silverlight. And then things like text blocks, which is really like a label, so it just displays a piece of text, and text boxes, which I'm sure you're very familiar with from any UI framework that you've ever used. Alongside of that we have some more complicated controls, so things like the calendar. So here's the calendar control. You can see that here we are data binding this calendar control, and we can pick dates and so on. We have it over here in a slightly different format showing years. We also have a similar control called a date picker, and this allows us just to drop down and select a date using something that looks like that calendar control. We have controls like the list box, and a list box sounds like a really sort of boring control, but one of the interesting things again about Silverlight controls being content controls is that whilst they can just contain very dull looking pieces of text, they can also contain just about any piece of content you like. So what we're seeing here is a list box with an ellipse and a rectangle and a working button in there and a date picker in there, and here's a working text box in the middle of a list box item. And something that would be traditionally quite hard to do in user interface technologies like Windows Forms and MFC and so on is very easy in technologies like Silverlight and Windows Presentation Foundation that allow you to put arbitrary content into these places. When it comes to doing things like displaying media, we have things like the image, which will display images for us. We have the media element, which will play videos for us. So that's going to play videos for us. And we then have perhaps the most complicated control, which is the data grid. Let's just set its source here so it displays something. The data grid is most like a spreadsheet. So you can see that we've got various items here, and they're sort of collapsing and expanding. And once again, in the middle of this grid cell, we've got arbitrary UI in here. We made some separate videos about the data grid if you're interested in that, so that might be something that you might want to follow up with. Finally, the other thing we've got in here is some things around laying things out. So we have simple controls like a border. A border is a very simple thing. You wrap a border around another piece of content and it just adds a border to that. All of these samples that we've been looking at have a split mode here where they show the XAML at the bottom and the results of that XAML at the top, or we can move to tab mode and use the tab control to show that we've got the results of the XAML and then the XAML code that lives behind it. So it's just an illustration of two things really. We see the XAML code, we see the effect, and we also see the tab control providing this UI that we're using here to look at XAML. So that was a border. We also have things like a scroll viewer. So scroll viewer takes its content and just makes it scrollable. So if the space that the scroll viewer occupies isn't big enough for the content, it just provides scroll bars automatically, or actually you can control that as well. And it's very simple to make something scrollable. It couldn't get much easier than that in order to do that kind of thing. And then again with layout, we have different panels for laying things out. So we have panels like the stack panel, and the stack panel essentially goes and stacks things up vertically or horizontally. You see the XAML code for that, where we're stacking 3 items vertically or horizontally. And then we have the grid over here, and the grid essentially lays things out as you would expect in a grid with proportional layout and all kinds of fancy things that we can do to control the layout of the grid. Again, just looking at the XAML code, fairly simple to make that work. And when you're using that grid layout, just as one final thing here, we have a control called a grid splitter, and what this allows you to do is dynamically resize portions of the UI just by providing a kind of Explorer-like interface really for doing that kind of thing. Once again, if you're interested in the grid splitter, we made a separate video about that. If you're interested in grid layout, stack panel layout, we made separate videos about those things as well, along with canvas layout, which isn't illustrated here. So, just a quick tour of the sorts of controls we might expect to see in Silverlight. Again, this is a set that's built into Beta 2, but you can go ahead and build your own controls, and obviously that facilitates a whole third-party industry around building controls, plus your own custom controls you might want to build into applications.